In episode 117, titled Compliance and Privacy, PII, Proprietary Data and Risk-Aware Handling, we focus on handling data responsibly because privacy failures and data misuse do not stay technical problems for long. They become business crises that trigger legal exposure, reputational damage, and operational disruption, often all at once. In data science work, it is easy to concentrate on model performance and forget that the raw materials of your work are often people and confidential business assets. The exam expects you to recognize what counts as sensitive, how to reduce exposure through minimization and controls, and how to communicate compliance needs early so architecture and workflow decisions are shaped correctly. This topic is not about fear. It is about discipline, because teams that treat privacy as an afterthought end up rewriting pipelines under pressure. If you build with risk awareness from the beginning, you reduce the chance of accidental leakage through logs, exports, or model outputs. The goal of this episode is to give you a practical framework, identify sensitive data, reduce it to what is needed, protect it with controls, and document purpose and access. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the DataX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Personally identifiable information, abbreviated as PII, is data that identifies an individual or can be used to re-identify an individual when combined with other data. Direct identifiers include obvious fields like names, email addresses, phone numbers, and government identifiers. But PII also includes indirect identifiers that can pinpoint a person when linked, such as precise location histories, device identifiers, or unique combinations of demographic attributes. The key concept is re-identification, meaning that even if a single field does not name someone, the overall record can still be identifying if it is unique enough in context. This is why PII definitions often include both direct and quasi-identifiers, because privacy risk is about what can be inferred, not just what is explicitly stated. In model development, PII often appears in training datasets, feature pipelines, and debugging outputs, which is where accidental exposure commonly occurs. Recognizing PII therefore means thinking about linkability and uniqueness, not just about obvious labels. The exam expects you to treat re-identification as part of the definition, because that is how privacy failures happen. Proprietary data is confidential business information that creates competitive advantage or legal obligation, and therefore requires controls even when it does not identify individuals. This includes trade secrets, pricing strategies, internal financial data, customer lists, product roadmaps, internal security logs, and any internal operational data whose exposure could harm the organization. Proprietary data may also include partner data governed by contracts, meaning access and use are constrained by agreement even if the content seems benign. In many DataX scenarios, proprietary data is the substrate of modeling because businesses want to optimize internal processes, detect fraud, or improve customer outcomes using their own unique datasets. The governance requirement is that proprietary data should be treated as sensitive by default, with clear purpose limitation and access control. In practice, proprietary data risk is often triggered by unnecessary exports, poorly secured storage, or casual sharing of sample records in documents. Recognizing proprietary data means recognizing that confidentiality is a risk dimension independent of personal privacy. Protecting it is not optional because it is part of business resilience. Data minimization is one of the most effective privacy controls because it reduces risk at the source by collecting and retaining only what is needed for the stated purpose. Minimization forces you to ask whether each field is necessary to support the decision the model is intended to influence. If a field does not improve performance meaningfully or is not required for the workflow, it should not be collected or used, because every additional field increases attack surface and exposure. Minimization also reduces the chance of accidental leakage because fewer sensitive fields flow through pipelines, notebooks, and logs. This is especially important when teams are experimenting because exploratory workflows are where data tends to be copied and moved around most. Minimization is also aligned with compliance principles in many regimes, which expect organizations to demonstrate purpose limitation and proportionality. In practice, minimization is a design decision as much as a policy because it affects what data enters storage, what is transformed, and what becomes part of long-lived feature stores. Treating minimization as a requirement rather than as an aspiration is a hallmark of mature privacy practice. Masking and obfuscation reduce exposure in workflows by limiting how sensitive fields appear in logs, dashboards, exports, and debugging artifacts. Masking typically means partially hiding values, such as showing only the last few characters of an identifier, while obfuscation can involve tokenization, hashing, or reversible encryption under controlled access. The goal is not to eliminate sensitivity, because masked or tokenized data can still be sensitive, but to reduce the blast radius if outputs are viewed by unauthorized people or if files are mishandled. These techniques are especially important in development and monitoring environments where people often inspect records to diagnose issues. If raw PII appears in logs, it can be copied into ticketing systems or chat tools, spreading exposure across systems that were not designed to store it. Obfuscation also supports separation of duties, where analysts can work with tokens and only a small, authorized group can resolve tokens when necessary. The exam expects you to recognize masking as a practical control that reduces accidental disclosure risk. It is an operational hygiene tool, not just a cryptography detail. Anonymization must be chosen carefully because many approaches that look anonymous are vulnerable to linkage, meaning individuals can be re-identified by combining datasets or by matching unique patterns. Removing names is not enough if other fields remain that can identify a person through uniqueness. Even aggregated or generalized data can be re-identified if the aggregation level is too fine or if external datasets exist that can be matched. This is why true anonymization is difficult and why many systems rely on de-identification and risk reduction rather than claiming perfect anonymity. The practical lesson is that privacy risk depends on the attacker's auxiliary information, which you may not fully control, and therefore any claim of anonymity should be treated with skepticism unless the method and threat model are well defined. In applied work, you often treat anonymization as a spectrum of risk reduction, not as a binary state. The exam often probes this with linkage examples, and the correct response is to acknowledge re-identification risk and choose cautious controls. Avoiding overconfident anonymity claims is part of risk-aware handling. Aggregation can reduce privacy risk when it is applied at a level that prevents individuals from being singled out, and it is often one of the safest approaches for sharing and reporting. Aggregation replaces individual records with summaries, such as counts, averages, and distributions, which can preserve useful signal while removing direct traceability. The key is choosing an aggregation level that provides anonymity through group size and avoids small cells that could identify people, such as rare combinations in small populations. Aggregation is particularly useful when stakeholders need insights rather than record-level detail because it supports decision-making without exposing individuals. However, aggregation is not automatically safe if groups are too small or if repeated queries allow reconstruction, which is why governance often includes rules about minimum group sizes and suppression of rare categories. In practice, you decide whether aggregation is adequate by considering who will access the data, what external data might exist, and whether the summaries could still reveal sensitive information. The exam expects you to recognize aggregation as a privacy-reducing strategy, but also to recognize that it requires careful thresholds. Using aggregation wisely is often the fastest path to safer analytics. Restricted data should not be used without clarity on licensing, consent, and allowable use, because legal permission is as important as technical capability. Partner datasets may have contractual restrictions on how they can be processed, whether they can be combined with other data, and whether models trained on them can be shared or commercialized. Personal data often requires consent or a legitimate basis for processing depending on jurisdiction and policy, and that basis must match the stated purpose. Even internally collected data may be restricted if employees or customers were told it would be used only for a specific purpose. Using restricted data without clarity creates compliance risk and can invalidate the entire project, even if the model performs well. The practical lesson is that data provenance and usage rights must be confirmed early, not after a model has been built. This is why compliance discussions shape architecture, because they determine whether data can be centralized, whether it must be segmented, and what auditing is required. The exam expects you to treat licensing and consent as gating requirements, not as paperwork after the fact. Access controls should be documented so it is clear who can see data and for what reason, because accountability is a core element of privacy and confidentiality governance. Documentation should include role-based access, approval processes, and any separation between raw sensitive data and derived features. It should also include audit logging expectations so access can be reviewed and investigated if misuse is suspected. Access control is not only about preventing malicious actors, it is also about preventing accidental exposure, such as when a well-intentioned analyst exports data to an unsecured location. Clear access rules also support least privilege, meaning people receive only the access needed to perform their role. In data science work, this often means giving many users access to aggregated or de-identified data while restricting raw PII access to a smaller group under stricter controls. Documenting access is also essential for audits and for incident response because you need to know where data went and who touched it. The exam rewards the idea that access control is a documented process, not just a technical setting. Retention and deletion policies limit long-term exposure by reducing how long sensitive data remains available for misuse or breach. The longer you retain data, the more opportunities exist for accidental leaks, unauthorized access, or drift into new uses that were not originally intended. Retention policies define how long raw data is kept, how long derived features are kept, and how long logs containing sensitive fields are retained. Deletion policies ensure that when data is no longer needed, it is removed from storage systems, backups where feasible, and downstream caches or exports. These policies also support compliance obligations in many regimes that require data not be held longer than necessary for the purpose. In model lifecycle terms, retention affects reproducibility because training data and feature snapshots may be needed for audits, so you must balance privacy risk with governance needs. A mature approach defines what must be retained for accountability and what can be deleted to reduce exposure. The exam expects you to recognize retention as a control that reduces risk over time. Compliance needs should be communicated early because they shape architecture choices like where data is stored, how it is processed, and what outputs can be generated safely. If privacy constraints require that PII remain in a secure environment, that influences whether training happens centrally or in a restricted enclave. If proprietary data must be compartmentalized, that influences how feature stores are built and how access is granted. If consent limits certain uses, that influences which features can be included and whether certain model outputs are allowed. Early communication prevents expensive rework because building a pipeline that ignores compliance often means rebuilding it later under pressure. It also helps stakeholders understand why certain desirable features cannot be used or why certain outputs must be masked. Compliance is not a blocker when handled early. It is a design constraint that produces safer systems. The exam expects you to treat compliance as a design input, not an afterthought. Monitoring for data leakage is essential because sensitive data can escape through unexpected channels like logs, exports, and model outputs. Logs are a common risk because developers often print sample records during debugging, and those prints can end up stored in log aggregation systems. Exports are a risk because analysts may download datasets to local machines or share them via insecure channels, creating uncontrolled copies. Model outputs can also leak information if the model memorizes sensitive details or if prediction explanations reveal raw feature values that include PII. This is why governance includes output review, access controls on monitoring dashboards, and checks that explanations do not expose sensitive attributes. The practical goal is to treat every step of the workflow as a potential leak path and to build controls that prevent sensitive fields from appearing where they should not. Monitoring for leakage is also an incident response capability because it allows you to detect and contain exposure quickly. The exam often tests this by asking where leaks occur, and the correct response includes logs and outputs, not just databases. The anchor memory for episode 117 is to protect identity, protect secrets, and document purpose and access. Protect identity means identify PII and re-identification risk, minimize it, and control exposure through masking, aggregation, and access controls. Protect secrets means treat proprietary business data as confidential and apply the same discipline of least privilege, controlled sharing, and monitoring. Document purpose and access means record why the data is used, who can use it, and under what rules, so governance is enforceable and audits are possible. This anchor works because it captures the two major sensitivity categories and the governance mechanism that keeps controls real. It also reminds you that compliance is not only about security, it is about purpose limitation and accountability. When you keep this anchor, you can respond to privacy scenarios with a consistent, risk-aware posture. To conclude episode 117, titled Compliance and Privacy, PII, Proprietary Data and Risk-Aware Handling, name one privacy risk and one mitigation you would choose so the response is concrete. A common privacy risk is re-identification through linkage, where de-identified records can be matched across datasets using quasi-identifiers like location, device identifiers, and unique behavior patterns. A strong mitigation is data minimization paired with aggregation and strict access controls, ensuring that only the minimum necessary fields are used and that outputs are shared at a group level rather than at an individual level whenever possible. If record-level data is required, masking or tokenization can reduce exposure in workflows, while retention limits reduce long-term risk. The key is that mitigation should reduce both the likelihood of exposure and the impact if exposure occurs. When you can name a risk and a matching mitigation this clearly, you demonstrate the exam-level competence of risk-aware data handling. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.